All right, the next topic we want to look at is emergency funds. So, what is an emergency fund? An emergency fund is a fund that a client can fall back on in the event that they experience an unexpected expense or experience a loss in ability to produce income. All right, so these are really funds that are set aside to protect against contingencies, right? Uncertainties that may pose a risk to the financial plan. And so we want to make sure that we're adequately funded through an emergency fund to really insulate and protect that plan in the event that something uncertain ends up coming a reality. All right, so why do clients need an emergency fund? Number one, it keeps us on track, right? If we have a short-term interruption in income, or if we have a large expense that was unexpected, it doesn't impact our other plan resources, right? We don't have to reduce assets, or we don't have to use cash flows that were intended to go to fund goals. We also don't have to potentially take on additional liabilities that create expenses and restrict our financial flexibility moving forward. Okay, so this is really nice as a plan protector, and it's really one of the reasons that we think of this as a financial planning prerequisite. So when we're thinking about emergency funds, one of the things that we oftentimes ask is how much should a client have in an emergency fund? The most commonly used benchmark is 3 to 6 months of expenses. Now, when we're looking at expenses, we can look at this a couple of different ways, right? Do we say based on all expenses, or do we say just necessary expenses? A lot of times we'll look at it both ways. We'll say, hey, listen, what would we need to cover all expenses to maintain the exact same standard of living that a client is covering now, right? The other way we might look at this and say, hey, listen, if a client lost a job or became injured or disabled or whatever the case may be, what are the necessary expenses that we've got to cover? Um, and so there's not really necessarily a right or wrong. It depends on what the objective of the emergency fund is. Is it to maintain lifestyle as it is, or is it short term to protect necessary expenses and the abilities of the client to survive at a minimal lifestyle? So we can look at it both ways to determine what's optimal for a given client. Now, another thing that we need to think about is the size of the emergency fund. 3 to 6 months is a pretty large range. And so how do we determine where we need to fall within that range? Or even if we need to be within that range. Some clients we might say need less than 3 months, and some clients we might say need more than 6. And so a lot of the considerations that we make will be in relation to the client's risk exposures, right? And the first thing that we'll probably look at is what is the level of risk that their income is exposed to? And the higher the risk to income, the bigger the emergency fund probably needs to be. Part of the risk of income we look at is how long would it take the client to replace their current income level if they were to lose their job? Um, and the longer that might take, obviously, the more emergency fund that we would need in place. Other things that we look at are family dynamics, right? And personal demographics, like how healthy is the client? Are they more disposed to health issues, health risks? Are there children in the home, right? And what are the situations around the children? There's a lot of things that we could look at as far as kids are concerned that may increase or decrease the risk of the household. And so we'll look at a lot of these risk factors in saying, okay, based on the exposure of a given client, really how big of an emergency fund do we actually need? So let's look at an example here. Molly and Tim have $9,000 in liquid assets, earn $5,000 a month, and spend $4,500 a month. What is their liquidity ratio or their emergency fund ratio? And is it adequate? Well, in this case, all we know is total expenses, right? So we can take their liquid assets, right, and divide it by monthly expenses. And so 9,000 divided by 4,500 is 2. So that tells us with our liquid assets, we could cover 2 months worth of expenses. And so we would say it's 2. And is it adequate? Well, it doesn't meet our benchmark. So as far as we know, it's not adequate, right? So that would be the answer to that question. Now, in some cases, we might look at a client that has 2 months of emergency reserves and say, hey, listen, we're comfortable with that. That's perfectly fine, right? But if we're just following the benchmark, then we would say no, that it's not adequate in this case. So like I talked about, there's a bunch of factors that go into determining the recommended size. One of the things that I didn't mention in the previous slide was risk preference. And so usually we would say the more risk averse, a little bit bigger the emergency fund maybe, right? That extra layer of protection might help that client sleep better at night. The more risk tolerant, maybe the smaller the emergency fund, or maybe the likelihood increases that will push that emergency fund down to the lowest adequate limit, right? Because that client might say, hey, listen, there's too much opportunity cost to having cash sitting around in low interest bearing accounts, right? I'd rather go out, invest, and take more risk with that money to grow wealth over time. So risk tolerance is definitely a factor in addition to the things that we've already discussed that we would want to consider. So where should emergency funds be invested? Emergency funds are always going to be invested in accounts that are very liquid. You might hold something in a regular savings account, but probably the most common holding place for emergency funds is a money market mutual fund, right? So money market mutual fund is a market investment that holds extremely low risk securities. But because it is a market investment, it does earn a little bit higher yields than traditional bank products normally would. So you do get the benefit of higher yields. The consequence of using a money market mutual fund, because it is a market investment and not a bank product, is it's not covered by FDIC insurance. And so that's one thing to consider, but usually that's not a deterrent because of the very low risk nature of the investments that money market mutual funds hold. Now, when thinking about liquidity, we wouldn't just consider a money market mutual funds. There's other types of accounts we might consider. We might consider money market accounts. Those are higher yield savings accounts that are bank products. We might consider CDs. We might consider, again, traditional savings accounts. So we have options with regards to where we might hold this. But again, we always are going to think about liquidity for emergency funds. And so if we're putting these in order from most to least liquid, and one of the things that we need to understand is liquidity has a two-part definition. Ability to convert to cash without loss in value. And so even though we can change or we can convert stock market mutual funds to cash really quickly, they're exposed to much higher losses in value or much higher chances for losses in value. Okay, so that's what impacts their liquidity in terms of the purest definition at the end of the day. Easy to convert to cash. And can convert to cash at a rate that we expect them to convert to cash to. But while we're holding assets that are exposed to higher levels of risk, that means they might be subject to higher levels of loss. And so we don't view those as having as high of liquidity. All right, so most to least liquid, we would probably say savings account is the most liquid. Money market accounts and money market mutual funds is the second most liquid. We'd probably say that you could probably go back and forth between. In terms of pure liquidity, we'd probably say a stock mutual fund is next most liquid. A CD is fourth most liquid because it's what's called a time deposit. A time deposit says that, hey, listen, this has to be held in this account for this amount of time. to maturity. If you don't hold the money in that account until the time expires, then you are subject to losing any earnings on that money and potentially even fees and penalties associated with early distribution. And then real estate would be the least liquid by far. Okay. So we know what savings accounts are, right? Savings accounts are just interest-bearing accounts that are designed to move money out of the normal day-to-day operating budget. Certificates of deposit we just talked about. These are a little bit higher yielding accounts. And the reason they pay a little bit higher yield is because they are time deposits, right? We have to hold those to maturity. So they do have a little bit of a liquidity premium on them. If there's something that you should always get paid for, it is increased risk or reduced liquidity. And so certificates of deposit have a little bit lower levels of liquidity, and so they pay a little bit higher rates of interest. Money market accounts are bank instruments that function very much like a savings account. The only difference is money market accounts usually have much higher minimum account balance requirements, and they oftentimes also restrict the number of transactions that can take place during a given period. If you make more than the allowed transactions, then there's probably going to be a penalty for any additional transactions that are made. Okay, so a little bit less liquid than a savings account, but again, the benefit is a little bit higher rates of return. Then you have money market mutual funds, like we said, very low risk market investments, US Treasury bills. These are commonly held in money market mutual funds along with other types of market securities. Treasury bills are just short-term US bonds, basically. Very low risk, but pay a little bit higher rates of interest than do, again, traditional savings accounts. US savings bonds, don't even really need to talk about them. And then inflation indexed bonds. Inflation index bonds are pretty popular if we're looking to protect against inflation, usually as part of some retirement income planning strategy. And so what an inflation index bond says is, hey, listen, the rate of return on this bond is going to pay a guaranteed rate to cover inflation for the period that the bond is being held, plus some additional premium for the risk associated with the bond. And so these are really nice because they always provide a yield that ensures lack of risk due to inflation, right? They protect against inflation. All right. So we talked about the benchmark for emergency funds being 3 to 6 months. And we talked some about the trade-offs, right? If we're going to hold 3 to 6 months of expenses in a high liquidity, low return account, then I know that I'm going to be giving up some returns, right? There is going to be some opportunity costs associated with holding money in these accounts that we're talking about. Now, to offset that, we can use a couple of different strategies. We can use a layering strategy or laddering strategies. Okay, so layering means that we're going to use a variety of different accounts with different risk exposures to distribute our emergency fund monies across. Okay, so we might say, hey, listen, we're going to have a portion of our emergency fund in a money market account, another portion of our emergency fund in an intermediate term CD, and then the last little bit of our emergency fund is going to be held in securities, right? And by layering the emergency fund across different account types, we can increase the average yield of all of the assets, reduce the opportunity cost, but still maintain good liquidity in the short term. Very similar to that is we can ladder. Anytime we ladder, it's because we're using securities that have known maturity dates. Again, if you're going to get paid or if you're going to have reduced liquidity, we should get paid for that reduced liquidity. And so CDs, bonds, T-bills, these are all things that have maturity dates tied to them. And the longer the maturity date on these types of instruments, the higher the return for those things. And so we'll look at an example of laddering with CDs here in just a second. Okay, so let's say that your grandmother has $90,000 she wants to keep in a CD at a local bank. However, she would like the highest return possible and she needs the money for short-term emergencies. So she wants good yield, but she also wants good liquidity. Her only other liquid assets are $10,000 in a money market deposit account and $2,000 in a checking account. Okay, so what could we do? Well, let's look at a laddering strategy with CDs. This is very basic. So let's say that we took the $90,000 and divided it evenly 4 ways. So we're going to create 4 accounts with $22,500 in each account. Okay. Now with CDs, we would say, hey, let's put $22,500 in a 3-month CD. Let's put $22,500 in a 6-month CD. 22,500 in a 9-month, and 22,500 in a 12-month. Okay, so when we look at this, the 3-month CD is going to have the lowest yield, right? It's the most liquid, so it has the lowest premium tied to that account. So it pays 1% interest over the holding period. 6-month, 1.5%, all the way up to 12-month that pays 2.5%. So at the very beginning of this arrangement, the average rate of return on the $90,000 is 1.75%. But what's going to happen, every 3 months, one of these CDs is going to mature. All right, so when this first 3-month CD matures, we're going to take that and we're going to put it into a 12-month CD. Okay, and then when the 6-month CD matures, we're going to take that and we're going to put it into a 12-month CD. And then 3 months later, when the 9-month matures, we're going to take that and put it into a 12-month CD. And so eventually what we'll have over the course of a year is we'll have 4 12-month CDs, but they're going to be maturing over a rolling 3-month period, right? And so at that point in time, the entire $90,000 is earning 2.5% interest, but it has the same liquidity characteristics as our original setup, right? And so that's just a way to use a little bit of creativity to our advantage to maintain liquidity, but also increase yield at the same time. Well, there's a lot to be said about emergency funds, but that's a pretty good overview of the topic and how we think about the basics of setting this up and managing the emergency fund for a client.